This game, perhaps more than any other, is the reason Alireza Firouzja is in the candidates tournament to compete against world champion Magnus Carlsen. This is a game against David Howell played in the FIDE Grand Swiss in 2021, and it was a qualifying event for the candidates. Firouzja played very well in this tournament. I'd like to go over this game. This is a game Firouzja has the white pieces, David Howell has the black pieces. Let's jump right in. Firouzja begins with e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop to c4, and David Howell chooses to play the Italian game. He could have played the two knights defense, of course, with knight to f6, but we get a mainline Italian game, castles, knight f6, d3, and he plays h6. David Howell stops the bishop from pinning on g5. Also notice the position of the two kings. White's castled, black's king is not castled. Sometimes in these positions, black will choose to play the g-pawn to g5 and attack the castled king, although David Howell does not choose to do that in this game. Firouzja plays c3, which covers the d4 square and prepares a later push of the d-pawn to d4. d6, rook to e1, defending e4. Castles h3, keeping a bishop out of g4, or a knight. a5. Now, there are a couple of choices here for black. David Howell could have also played a6. Both of them allow the bishop to tuck back to a7. a6 gains less space, but keeps the b5 square under control. a5, his choice, gains more space, but makes the b5 square a little bit more sensitive. Knight b to d2, beginning the classical maneuver in Ruy Lopez and Italian game positions. Knight f1, knight g3. Bishop e6 directly challenging the bishop. If Firouzja had taken the bishop, then after fe6, David Howell gets a half-open file and more control of the center. So Firouzja does not want to do that. Instead, he plays the bishop to the newly weakened b5 square and avoids the trade. Howell plays bishop to a7. He doesn't want Firouzja to play d4 with tempo later. Knight to f1, the maneuver continues. Knight to e7, and black basically comes up with the same maneuver. Knight e7, knight to g6. He wants to neutralize any kingside attacking pressure from white, and also he can play c6, kicking the bishop back. Knight g3, c6, bishop a4, b5, bishop c2, a4. So now David Howell has gained a lot of queenside space here, but white's pieces are very well placed. They're on nice squares. And these pawns, even though they've gained space, can become vulnerable later. They could be weakened and targeted. d4, gaining the full pawn center. Knight to g6, bishop to e3. So white has more central space. Black has more queenside space in this position. Rook to e8, bishop to d3. And this is the beginning of Firouzja targeting these advanced pawns. The b5 pawn could become vulnerable after, say, a d5 push that undermines the c6 pawn. So he's putting some indirect pressure on the b5 square. Bishop to b6, a3, that keeps these pawns fixed in place, keeps them from moving. Queen to c7 and rook to c1. Firouzja places his rook opposite his opponent's queen and plans to play c4. It would be much harder to generate any kingside activity here, as black, as you can see, has placed a lot of defensive pieces over by his king, so Firouzja is going to get activity on another part of the board instead. David Howell plays bishop to a5, pins the c3 pawn, so Firouzja cannot play c4 just yet. He would lose the exchange if he did. So rook to e2, stepping out of that pin. Queen to b7, the queen moves away from the aim of the rook, and also some indirect pressure is placed on e4. Now c4. Pawn takes, bishop takes. And here David Howell plays a move that'll make your head spin. He plays d5. Look at the central tension in this position. I can't make heads or tails of what's going on here. This is really an unbelievably complicated position. But what does Firouzja do? Firouzja decides to maintain the tension. He plays bishop to d3. He doesn't exchange any pawns in the center. He tells his opponent, let's let you exchange first, and then we'll decide what to do. So Howell takes on d4. Firouzja takes with the knight, and that hits this c6 pawn. So the bishop goes back to d7 to defend the pawn, and now knight d to f5. And we know in e4, e5 openings, particularly the Spanish or the Italian game, White is really happy if they can put a knight on the f5 square. That's always a very valuable place for a knight to go. Bishop back to c7. Pawn takes, maybe taking with the knight. And this position could have been a little more accurate. But he takes with the pawn, and now bishop to d4. Enormous pressure against the g7 pawn. He's also threatening to just take the knight with the bishop and then play knight to h6 check. So David Howell has to neutralize that pressure, which he does with bishop to e5. And in this position, one of Firouzja's options was to just play rook takes bishop. And after knight takes, knight to d6, getting the exchange back by forking the queen and the rook, queen b8, knight takes, bishop takes, and then the other knight goes to f5, and Firouzja would continue to maintain the pressure. But he played another also good option. He plays knight to h6 check. And what this does is it unleashes this bishop on the g6 knight, which is a defender of the bishop on e5. So it's like a house of cards. If one falls, then the rest will fall. Pawn takes knight, bishop takes g6, removing the defender. So this bishop is now attacked twice by the bishop at d4 and the rook at e2. So he makes the in-between move, bishop to g3, to sort of get rid of that vulnerability. Rook takes e8 check, rook takes e8, and the simple move, pawn takes bishop, would have been fine for white, but Firouzja decides to keep the position as complicated as possible. He plays queen to f3, which attacks the knight at f6, the bishop at g3, while his own bishop at g6 is still hanging. Now, this next move is incredible. David Howell plays queen to c6, and it looks like he's making his queen vulnerable to the rook on c1. But in fact, the queen is directly attacking the rook on c1, because if the rook were to take the queen, rook e1 checkmate. So he's actually attacking a rook directly with his queen, a very unusual maneuver. So Firouzja blocks that with bishop to c2. This bishop goes back to b8, and then queen takes knight, and queen takes queen, bishop takes queen. So now we can look at this position and make an assessment. White is up a pawn, and black's pawns are a mess. This is an endgame that someone of Firouzja's caliber should win. So let's see how he goes about attempting to win this position. The rook goes to c8. There's a pin here on the c file. Bishop goes to c3 to break that pin. d4 kicks the bishop away. Bishop to d2. So now he defends the rook at c1. And the tension is now sort of gone, and Firouzja can begin to really gain traction in the position. King g7, bishop to d3, rook takes, bishop takes. So now we have a pure two-bishop endgame, two bishops versus two bishops, with white having a better structure and an extra pawn. h5, h4, Firouzja fixes the pawn at h5 as a weakness. Bishop c6, g3, bishop to d7, king f1. The king begins to march. As we know in the endgame, the king can be a very strong attacking piece. Bishop to e5, king to e2, bishop g4 check, king to d2, bishop to d7, king to c2. What he would like to do is to put that king on this square and put pressure on this pawn at d4. This is a real problem for black. So white would love to just move the king here, then maneuver his bishop and take the pawn at d4. Bishop to e6, now bishop to b5. Clears the d3 square and attacks the a4 pawn, and it can only be defended one way. Bishop to b3 check, but that allows the king to move to d3. Slowly but surely, Firouzja is getting the position he wants. King to g6. So David Howell wants to enter into the position with his own king. So Firouzja plays bishop to d7, controlling the f5 square and creating a barrier so that black's king cannot enter into the position. Bishop to d1, bishop to d2. Now the maneuver of the bishop begins to come here and capture this d4 pawn. f5, and here he decides to play bishop f4 immediately. David Howell cannot exchange the bishops. If he plays bishop takes f4 after gf4, look at this position. The king is going to take d4. It's a light squared bishop ending. All of the black's pawns are on light squares, not to mention he's down a couple of pawns. So he cannot take that bishop. He must retreat the bishop. bishop to g7, now bishop to d6, continuing the maneuver to take d4. Bishop f6, bishop to e8 check. He doesn't have to play this, but it's good technique to push your opponent's king as far away as possible from the theater of the action. So the king moves to h6, bishop comes to c5, f4, bishop takes d4. He finally grabs that pawn. Bishop to d8. David Howell knows every exchange brings him closer to a losing position, so he avoids exchanges at all costs. King to d2, hitting the bishop at d1, bishop b3, bishop e5, pawn takes, bishop to a5 check, king to c1. And in this position, David Howell resigned. He's down 2 pawns, and the move bishop to f4 check, forcing this king away from the h5 pawn and losing that pawn also, is now unstoppable. So this was a really well-executed game from Firouzja, really an example of great endgame technique, and winning this tournament is what put him in the candidates. Thank you for joining us at Chess Dog. See you again soon. Bye.